In a trendy Seattle coffee shop during morning rush hour, a weathered man in a hoodie was moments away from facing complete parental humiliation in front of a room full of strangers. What started as a simple request for black coffee quickly turned into public embarrassment when the newly promoted manager, Rachel Dean, made her move to have him removed for not looking like he belonged. But Eli Hart wasn't just another homeless drifter. For 5 years, he operated as the founder and CEO of the entire grind coffee chain, responsible for building a multi-million-dollar empire based on dignity and second chances. When Rachel attempted to force him out using company policy, she didn't realize she was triggering a reaction from someone trained to see through corporate facades and remember what true leadership actually meant. Eli launched a quiet revelation that unleashed consequences far beyond what anyone in that cafe expected, exposing not just his identity, but the soul of a company that had lost its way. What began as a simple coffee order transformed into a masterclass on power, humility, and what happens when you judge someone by their appearance instead of their character. After that day, everyone in that Seattle cafe would never forget the name Hart and the lesson that true power doesn't need to prove itself. It just needs to remember what it stands for. Before we dive into this story, can you tell us where you're watching right now? This story about hidden identity and true power might hit closer to home than you think. Smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories like this one. The rain drummed against the floor 2 ceiling windows of grind coffee, each drop catching the warm, amber light that spilled from the Edison bulbs hanging above polished concrete floors. Seattle's morning rush hour had descended like a symphony, laptops clicking, espresso machines hissing, conversations blending into the kind of urban tight noise that made solitude possible in a crowd. Rachel Dean moved through the space with the precision of someone who had finally found her rhythm. 3 weeks into her promotion to manager, she'd already reorganized the staff schedule, updated the inventory system, and implemented what she called elevated customer experience protocols. The cafe hummed with efficiency under her watch, every surface gleaming, every interaction measured and professional. She paused near the register, scanning the room with the eye of someone who understood that details mattered. The morning regulars had claimed their usual spots, the tech executive in the corner booth, fingers flying across his phone screen, the group of university students sharing a table piled high with textbooks and coffee cups, the woman with silver-streaked hair who always ordered a cortado and spent hours writing in a leather-bound journal. There was the man in the hoodie. Rachel's gaze lingered on him, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He sat alone at a small table near the window, his hands folded on the empty surface before him. No laptop, no phone, no coffee cup, just a quiet presence that seemed to absorb rather than contribute to the cafe's energy. His hoodie was dark gray, well-worn but clean, and he wore it with the hood down, revealing sandy brown hair that looked like it hadn't seen a professional cut in months. His face was weathered in a way that suggested stories Rachel wasn't sure she wanted to hear. She'd noticed him before, always sitting without ordering, always watching. Today, something about his stillness felt different, more intentional, more present. "Simon," she called to the barista behind the counter, her voice carrying just enough authority to turn heads. "How long has that gentleman been sitting there?" Simon? Torres looked up from the espresso machine he was cleaning, his dark eyes following Rachel's gaze. At 22, he possessed the kind of nervous energy that came from juggling college courses and part-time work, but there was something genuinely warm about him that customers responded to. He studied the man in the hoodie for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know, maybe 15 minutes. He hasn't ordered anything yet." Simon's voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if he sensed the weight behind Rachel's question. Rachel straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar surge of responsibility that came with her position. This was her cafe now, her responsibility to maintain the standards that made grind coffee special. She'd worked too hard to get here, to let anyone compromise the atmosphere she'd so carefully cultivated. Nina Rodriguez, the woman with the silver hair, glanced up from her journal as Rachel approached the man's table. Something in the manager's posture made her pause, her pen hovering over the page. She'd been coming to this cafe for over a year, long enough to recognize most of the regulars, long enough to notice patterns, and she'd definitely seen this man before, quiet, unobtrusive, but somehow familiar in a way that nagged at the edges of her memory. "Excuse me," Rachel said, stopping beside the table. Her voice was professional but firm, the tone she'd perfected during her years working her way up from barista to assistant manager to her current position. "I'm Rachel, the manager here. I notice you've been sitting for a while without ordering. Are you planning to make a purchase today?" The man looked up, and Rachel was struck by his eyes, gray-green, steady, with the kind of depth that suggested he'd seen more than his share of the world. He didn't seem surprised by her approach, didn't appear defensive or uncomfortable. If anything, there was something almost knowing in his expression. "I'd like a black coffee, please," he said simply. His voice was quiet but clear, with a slight rasp that spoke of early mornings and late nights. Rachel felt her professional smile tighten. "I'm sorry, but we have a policy about loitering. This is a cafe, not a public space." If you're not going to order immediately and pay, I'll have to ask you to leave. The words hung in the air like smoke, and suddenly the conversations around them seemed to dim. The tech executive looked up from his phone. The university students paused mid-sentence. Even the background music, some indie folk track that had been playing since opening, seemed to fade into the background. I just asked for a black coffee, the man said, his tone remaining steady. There was no aggression in his voice, no challenge, just a simple statement of fact. And I'm explaining our policy, Rachel replied, feeling the weight of watching eyes. She was aware of being observed, of this moment becoming a test of her authority. We've had issues with people who don't look like they belong here, making other customers uncomfortable. I'm sure you understand. The man in the hoodie studied her for a long moment, and Rachel felt an unexpected chill run down her spine. There was something in his gaze that reminded her of deep water, calm on the surface, but with currents running beneath that she couldn't quite read. I understand, he said finally, but I'd still like that coffee. From behind the counter, Simon shifted uncomfortably. He'd been working at Grind Coffee for 8 months, long enough to know that the man in the hoodie wasn't causing any trouble. In fact, he seemed to be the opposite of trouble, a quiet presence who never demanded attention, never made a scene. Something about Rachel's approach felt wrong, but he wasn't sure how to intervene without overstepping. Nina looked up from her journal again, her eyes moving between Rachel and the man in the hoodie. She'd been a regular here long enough to recognize the subtle rhythms of the place, long enough to know that this interaction was shifting the entire atmosphere of the cafe. Other customers were beginning to notice, phones discreetly turning toward the unfolding scene. Sir, Rachel said, her voice carrying a note of finality, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now. The man in the hoodie nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this outcome. He stood with the kind of deliberate care that suggested he was choosing his actions rather than being forced into them. As he rose, Rachel noticed that he was taller than she'd expected, his presence somehow more substantial when he wasn't folded into the small cafe chair. Before I go, he said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by the nearby tables, can I ask you something? Rachel crossed her arms, feeling the eyes of the cafe on her. What? What do you think this place is supposed to be about? The question caught her off guard. She'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even a scene. Instead, she found herself looking into those steady gray-green eyes and feeling like she was the one being evaluated. It's a cafe, she said, hearing how inadequate the answer sounded even as she spoke it. We serve coffee. We provide a comfortable environment for our customers. All of them, he asked quietly. The question lingered in the air as he moved toward the door, his footsteps nearly silent on the polished concrete. Rachel watched him go, feeling a strange mix of victory and unease. She'd maintained her standards, protected her customers, upheld the image of the cafe she'd worked so hard to. Perfect. So why did she feel like she'd just failed some test she hadn't known she was taking? As the door closed behind the man in the hoodie, the cafe's normal rhythm slowly resumed. Conversations picked up again, laptops reopened. The background music seemed to return to its normal volume. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, a tension that hadn't been there before. Simon continued cleaning the espresso machine, his movements mechanical, as his mind replayed the scene. He'd watched the man in the hoodie leave with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the encounter, and something about that composure unsettled him. In his experience, innocent people got angry when they were treated unfairly. They defended themselves, demanded explanations, made scenes. They didn't just accept it. Nina returned to her journal, but her pen remained still. She'd been writing about the nature of perception, about how people revealed themselves in moments of small power. Now she had a perfect example, but she wasn't sure how the story was supposed to end. Outside, the rain continued to fall, each drop adding to the rivers running down the windows. The man in the hoodie disappeared into the gray morning, leaving behind only questions and the lingering sense that something important had just happened, something that none of them fully understood yet. Rachel straightened the chairs around the empty table, her movements efficient and purposeful. She'd done the right thing, she told herself. She'd maintained standards, protected the atmosphere that made Grind Coffee special. The fact that she felt unsettled was just the natural aftermath of confrontation, nothing more. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the memory of those steady eyes, or the quiet way he'd asked his final question, all of them. The morning rush continued around her, but Rachel found herself glancing toward the window more often than usual, watching the rain and wondering about the man who'd disappeared into it. She'd won this encounter, she was sure of that. So why did victory feel so much like the beginning of something rather than the end? 5 years earlier, the conference room on the 32nd floor of the Columbia Center had buzzed with the kind of energy that came from possibility. Floor 2 ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline, Elliott Bay stretching blue-gray toward the Olympics in the distance. But Eli Hart's attention was focused on the people seated around the polished table, investors, advisors, and the small team that had helped him transform a simple idea into something that might actually change lives. He stood at the head of the table, his presentation materials spread before him, wearing a crisp button-down shirt and dark jeans that managed to look both professional and approachable. His hair was shorter then, his face unmarked by the weight of years and responsibility. But his eyes held the same steady intensity, the same quiet confidence that would one day unsettle a cafe manager on a rainy morning. Coffee shops are everywhere, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room, but most of them are just transactions. You walk in, you order, you pay, you leave. I want to build something different. Margaret Chen, the lead investor from Pacific Northwest Ventures, leaned forward. She'd been in this business long enough to hear every possible pitch, but something about Eli's quiet passion had caught her attention. Different how? Eli clicked to his next slide, but instead of charts or graphs, the screen showed a simple photograph. A young man sitting alone on a street corner, his belongings in a backpack beside him. The image was stark, honest, and somehow beautiful in its raw humanity. That's me, Eli said simply. 7 years ago. The room fell silent. Margaret's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine attention. Around the table, the other investors, successful people who'd built their careers on reading between the lines, suddenly found themselves looking at Eli with new eyes. I aged out of foster care at 18, he continued, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of lived experience. No family, no support system, no real skills beyond basic survival. I spent 2 years on the streets, learning what it meant to be invisible, to be judged by appearance, to be treated like a problem instead of a person. He clicked to the next slide. A small storefront with warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. People gathered around tables, conversations flowing like water. Coffee saved my life, he said. Not the caffeine, the ritual, the warmth, the fact that for the price of a cup, I could sit somewhere safe for a few hours, somewhere I could pretend I belonged. There was this one place, Muddy Waters, down in Pioneer Square. The owner was this old guy named Frank who never made me feel like I was taking up space. He'd let me sit there with a single cup for hours, sometimes slip me a pastry when he thought I wasn't looking. Margaret found herself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite herself. What happened to Frank? Heart attack, Eli said simply. 3 years ago. The place closed 6 months later. New owners came in, turned it into some kind of artisanal toast bar. He paused, looking out at the city sprawling below them. Frank understood something most people don't. Dignity isn't something you earn, it's something you give. The slide changed again, showing architectural renderings of a cafe. Space, warm wood, comfortable seating, large windows that invited the outside in. But what caught Margaret's attention were the details. Charging stations at every table, free Wi-Fi, a community board, spaces designed for both solitude and connection. I want to build coffee shops that remember Frank's lesson, Eli continued. Places where everyone belongs, where dignity is the default, where we serve people, not just coffee. I want to hire people who need second chances, who understand what it means to be overlooked. I want to create spaces where someone like me, someone like I was, can sit without feeling like they're stealing something. David Kim, another investor, spoke up. That's a beautiful story, Eli, but how do we make money? How do we scale? How do we ensure quality and consistency across multiple locations? Eli smiled the same quiet smile that would one day unsettle Rachel Dean, and by understanding that treating people with dignity isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business. Happy employees create happy customers. Inclusive spaces build loyal communities. And communities, David, they're worth more than any marketing campaign. The presentation continued for another hour, covering market analysis, expansion plans, operational details, but the heart of it remained that simple photograph and the story of a young man who'd learned the value of dignity from a cafe owner who'd never made him feel small. Later, as the investors filed out, Margaret lingered behind. Eli, she said, I have to ask why now. You've built a successful consulting business. You could easily stay in that world. Why risk everything on coffee shops? Eli was gathering his materials, but he paused at her question. Because I go into coffee shops all the time now, he said. And I see how they treat people who look like I used to look. And I remember what it felt like to be invisible, to be judged, to be made to feel like I was taking up space I hadn't earned. He looked out at the city again, at the thousands of people moving through their lives below. I want to build something that remembers what Frank taught me, something that proves you can be successful without forgetting where you came from. Margaret nodded slowly. And if we fund this, if we help you build this chain, what happens when you're not there to maintain that vision? How do we ensure that the company doesn't lose its way? It was a prescient question, one that would prove more relevant than either of them could have imagined. Eli considered it carefully, his expression thoughtful. I'll make sure, he said. Finally, I'll visit every location, talk to every manager, ensure that the mission stays alive. And if I ever find a place that's forgotten what we're supposed to be about, I'll remind them. 3 months later, the first Grind Coffee opened in Capitol Hill. Rachel Dean was one of the first hires, an ambitious young woman with a degree in business and dreams of working her way up in the food service industry. She'd been drawn to the company's mission. Impressed by Eli's vision of inclusive hospitality, the training was comprehensive, covering everything from espresso preparation to customer service. But what stood out to Rachel was the emphasis on dignity, on treating every customer like they belonged, regardless of appearance or circumstances. "We're not just serving coffee," Eli had told the first group of employees during orientation. "We're serving people, and every person who walks through our doors deserves to be treated with respect." Rachel had nodded along with the others, taking notes, absorbing the philosophy that would guide the company's growth. She'd believed in it then, had seen it as the foundation of something truly special. But that was 5 years ago. 5 years of promotions and responsibilities, of quarterly reports and operational efficiency, of building a career in an industry that rewarded results over relationships. Somewhere along the way, the original mission had gotten buried under layers of policy and procedure, lost in the daily grind of managing people and profits. Standing in the rain outside the cafe he'd built, Eli pulled out his phone and scrolled through the company's latest quarterly report. The numbers were good, better than good. Grind Coffee was profitable, expanding, building a loyal customer base across the Pacific Northwest. By every traditional measure, it was a success. But success, he'd learned, was a moving target. And sometimes, in the pursuit of growth and efficiency, you could lose sight of the reasons you'd started in the first place. He looked back through the rain-streaked windows at the cafe's warm interior, at the customers bent over laptops and phones, at Rachel moving efficiently between tables. It was everything he'd envisioned from a business perspective: clean, professional, successful. But Frank would have hated it. Eli put his phone away and walked back into the rain, his footsteps echoing off the wet pavement. He had thinking to do, decisions to make, and tomorrow, he had a cafe to visit. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean, preparing it for whatever would come next. The next morning brought no relief from Seattle's relentless rain. Eli sat in his downtown office 40 floors above the city, watching droplets race down floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Elliott Bay. The view should have been calming ferries cutting white wakes through gray water, the Olympic Mountains shrouded in mist, but his attention was fixed on the laptop screen, displaying his company's sudden infamy. A shaky phone video titled "Karen Manager Kicks Out Homeless Guy from Coffee Shop" had exploded across social media. Overnight, the footage was grainy, shot from across the cafe, but Rachel's voice came through clearly, sharp, professional, explaining the loitering policy with unmistakable authority. The comments section had become a digital wildfire. Thousands of angry responses, stories of discrimination, calls for boycotts. Local news stations were already reaching out. Eli's phone buzzed with a text from James Morrison, his regional operations manager. "Saw the video. We need damage control, fast." Eli closed the laptop and leaned back in his leather chair, the weight of 5 years pressing against his chest. This wasn't just about Rachel's behavior, it was a symptom of something deeper. The mission that had driven him to build Grind Coffee had been slowly suffocated under layers of corporate efficiency and profit margins. Frank's lesson about dignity had been reduced to bullet points in training manuals that no one really read. When James called, his voice was tight with corporate panic. "The videos everywhere. Eli, news stations, social media, review sites. We're getting hammered. We need a statement, an apology, maybe offer the guy compensation." "No," Eli said quietly, standing and walking to the window. "What do you mean, no? We have to respond. No damage control. No corporate apologies. No public relations campaigns." Eli's voice carried the steel that had built his company from nothing. "I'm going back to the cafe." "Eli, that's not to. Can't just James. Do you remember why we started this company?" The silence stretched between them. James had been there from the beginning, had helped develop the operational systems that made expansion possible. He'd heard Eli's story about Frank and dignity and creating spaces where everyone belonged. "Of course I remember," James said finally. "But we can't let one incident destroy everything we've built." "We're not destroying anything," Eli replied, watching the rain blur the city below. "We're saving it." An hour later, Eli stood outside, the downtown Grind Coffee, rain misting his worn hoodie. Through the windows he could see the morning rush in full swing, the same customers claiming the same tables, the same choreographed dance of espresso preparation and credit card transactions. But the atmosphere looked different now, charged with the electricity that comes when people know they're being watched. Rachel moved behind the counter with mechanical precision, her jaw set in the kind of determination that comes from trying to pretend everything is normal when the world feels like it's collapsing. She'd spent the night reading comments from strangers who called her everything from corporate drone to worse things she'd never heard applied to herself. Eli pushed open the door, shaking droplets from his jacket. The familiar sounds washed over him: espresso machines hissing, conversations humming, indie folk music floating from hidden speakers. But something fundamental had shifted in the space he'd designed as a sanctuary. Nina looked up from her journal. Immediately, her writer's instincts recognizing the return of yesterday's protagonist. She'd been thinking about the encounter all night, replaying the scene, trying to understand what had felt so wrong about the interaction. Now seeing him again, she felt anticipation flutter in her chest. Simon spotted him instantly, his hands pausing mid-motion as he steamed milk for a cappuccino. The barista had spent hours scrolling through social media, reading comment after comment about dignity and discrimination. Feeling increasingly sick about his own silence during yesterday's confrontation, Rachel saw him approach the counter and felt her stomach drop. She'd hoped he wouldn't return, that the viral video would be the end of it. But here he was, calm and patient, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had unsettled her before. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "I'd like a black coffee." Eli said the same simple request that had started everything. Rachel felt the weight of watching eyes. Half the cafe had phones discreetly positioned, ready to capture whatever happened next. She'd become the face of corporate discrimination overnight, the villain in a story being shared across platforms. "Of course," she managed, forcing her professional mask into place. "That'll be $3.50, as she processed his payment with mechanical efficiency. Eli reached into his jacket and placed something on the counter between them, a business card, cream cardstock with simple black lettering. Rachel glanced down and felt the world tilt off its axis. Eli Hart, founder and CEO, Grind Coffee. She stared at the card, then at him, then back at the card. Her mind rejected what her eyes were seeing. The scruffy man in the hoodie, the one she'd publicly humiliated, couldn't possibly be the founder. Was supposed to be corporate, polished, someone who looked like success? "You're lying," she whispered, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. "Simon?" Eli called to the barista, whose face had gone pale with recognition. "Could you call James Morrison? Tell him I'm here." Around them, the cafe had gone completely silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, laptops closed, phone cameras turned their way. Nina felt her pulse quicken, recognizing the moment she'd sensed building since yesterday. Simon's hands shook as he reached for the phone. "James, it's Simon from downtown. Mr. Hart is here. He wants to speak with you." Even from across the counter, Rachel could hear the sharp intake of breath from the other end. James's voice tight with surprise and concern. "5 years ago," Eli said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed space, "I built this company on a simple principle: everyone deserves dignity. I wanted to create places where people belonged, regardless of appearance or circumstances." Rachel felt tears beginning to form. "I was following policy." "Whose policy?" Eli asked gently. "This company was supposed to be different. It was supposed to remember Frank's lesson, that you can't judge people by how they look." The door burst open, and James Morrison rushed in, his face flushed from what must have been a record-breaking drive downtown. His expression confirmed what Rachel was. "Still struggling to process the plan," Eli said, looking around at the sea of watching faces, "is to remember who we are." The silence in the cafe stretched like a held breath, heavy with the weight of revelation. Rachel gripped the counter's edge, her knuckles white against the polished wood. James Morrison positioned himself beside Eli, his face cycling between professional concern and something that might have been pride. Around them, customers sat frozen, phones recording what they instinctively knew was a moment that would define everything. Eli looked around the room, taking in the sea of faces, some curious, some uncomfortable, some openly fascinated by the drama unfolding. These were the people Grind Coffee was supposed to serve, the community it was meant to nurture. But as he studied their expressions, he realized most of them had probably never been truly challenged, never made to feel unwelcome, never had to question whether they belonged. "Can I tell you all a story?" Eli asked, his voice carrying clearly through the space. It wasn't really a question, it was an invitation, offered with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his words would be heard. He moved away from the counter, walking slowly between the tables, his presence somehow making the large space feel intimate. Nina set down her pen, completely absorbed. The university students abandoned their laptops. Even the tech executive who'd been glued to his phone yesterday lowered his device, caught by something magnetic in Eli's demeanor. 7 years ago, Eli began, I was sleeping in Pioneer Square, 18 years old, alone, invisible. I learned what it meant to be judged by appearance, treated like a problem instead of a person. I learned that dignity isn't something most people think about until they've had it taken away. Rachel felt her stomach twist into knots. She'd heard versions of this story in corporate materials, but hearing it from the man she'd humiliated made every word land like a physical blow. "There was a coffee shop called Muddy Waters," Eli continued, his voice carrying the weight of cherished memory. "The owner was Frank Rossetti, 60 years old, hands permanently stained from grinding beans, with a policy that was never written down anywhere." He paused beside Nina's table, and she found herself looking up into those steady gray-green eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty and chosen kindness anyway. Frank's policy was beautifully simple. If you were human, you belonged. Didn't matter what you looked like, what you could afford, whether you'd showered or slept in a bed. If you had a heartbeat, you deserved dignity. Simon felt his throat tighten behind the counter. In 3 years of food service, he'd never heard anyone articulate what had always felt true to him, that serving people was about far more than taking orders and processing payments. Frank would let me sit for hours with one cup of coffee, Eli continued, moving through the cafe like he was blessing each table with his presence. He'd nod when I walked in, ask how I was doing, slip me day-old pastries when he thought I wasn't looking. He never made me feel like I was stealing space I hadn't earned. He never made me feel less than human. Rachel watched the transformation happening around her. The customers' expressions were shifting from curiosity to something deeper: recognition, understanding, shame. She realized everyone here had probably experienced moments of feeling judged, excluded, diminished. Frank died 3 years ago, Eli said, his voice carrying just a trace of the grief that still lived in his chest. Heart attack while opening the shop one morning. Muddy Waters closed 6 months later. New owners turned it into some kind of artisanal toast concept that charged $20 for avocado on bread. A few customers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing themselves in that description. I built Grind Coffee to honor Frank's memory, Eli continued, stopping in the center of the room where everyone could see him clearly. Every location was supposed to be a place where dignity was the default, where we served people, all people, with respect and kindness. He turned to face Rachel directly, and she saw not anger in his eyes, but profound disappointment mixed with something that might have been hope. Yesterday, you forgot that lesson. You made assumptions based on appearance. You decided who belonged and who didn't based on clothing, on posture, on your own unconscious biases about what success should look like. Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. I thought I was protecting the business. I know, Eli said, his tone gentle but unwavering. But true protection comes from staying true to our values, not abandoning them when they become inconvenient. Success built on exclusion isn't success at all, it's just dressed-up prejudice. He addressed the entire cafe now, his voice carrying to every corner. This isn't about punishment, it's about remembering who we are. Every person who walks through our doors has a story, has dignity, has worth. Our job isn't to judge those stories, it's to honor them. Looking back at Rachel, he offered something unexpected, a choice wrapped in grace. You can learn to lead with dignity, or you can leave. But if you stay, it means embracing what this place was built to be. It means seeing every customer as someone worthy of respect. Rachel nodded slowly, tears finally falling freely down her cheeks. I want to learn. I want to do better. I want to understand what I lost sight of. Eli's smile transformed his entire face, the same quiet expression that had unsettled her before. But now it felt like forgiveness, like possibility, like hope. Then let's start over, he said simply. He looked around the cafe one final time, at the faces that would carry this story forward. Sometimes the most powerful leadership is the quietest. Sometimes change happens not with noise and drama, but with the simple act of treating people like they matter. As the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, something fundamental shifted inside Grind Coffee. The foundation wasn't cracking, it was being rebuilt. One moment of dignity at a time. Simon stepped forward, his voice steady for the first time in days. Mr. Hart, that coffee you ordered, how do you take it? Eli's smile widened, reaching his eyes. Black. Just like Frank taught me. Simple, honest, no pretense. And for the first time in years, the cafe felt like what it was always meant to. Be a place where everyone belonged. The story wants us to learn that true power doesn't need to prove itself. Sometimes it just needs to remember what it stands for. If you enjoy stories like this where quiet strength speaks louder than status, hit like and subscribe to be the first to see what's coming next.